Fragments of Being. In the heart of the old city, where cobblestone streets wound like veins through the body of a sleeping giant, there was a house forgotten by time. Its windows, once clear and inviting, were now clouded with years of dust and memories. The door, thick and weathered, stood ajar, as if awaiting the return of someone who had long since vanished into the mists of history. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and the faint, lingering perfume of roses. The rooms were filled with relics of a past life. Photographs in tarnished frames, books with yellowed pages, and furniture draped in heavy, faded cloth. It was a place where time had stopped, where the echoes of laughter and the whispers of secrets still hung in the air like ghostly echoes. Amara, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering curiosity, had always been drawn to the old house. As a child, she would stand outside its gate, peering through the iron bars, wondering what stories lay hidden within its walls. Now, as an adult, she found herself drawn back to the house, compelled by a force she couldn't quite explain. The night she finally stepped inside, the moon was a thin crescent in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over the world. She pushed the door open with a creak that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the house. As she stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been there before, in another life, in another time. Each step she took echoed in the silence, a reminder that she was intruding upon a world that was not her own. The house seemed to breathe around her, the walls pulsing with a life of their own. She wandered through the rooms, her fingers trailing over the surfaces, feeling the texture of the past beneath her touch. In one of the rooms, she found an old piano, its keys yellowed and chipped, but still beautiful in its decrepitude. She sat down on the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had never played the piano before, but as she pressed the first note, a melody began to form, something ancient and haunting. The music flowed from her fingertips, filling the room with a sound that seemed to come from the very soul of the house. As she played, images began to flash before her eyes, fragments of a life that was not her own. A young woman, laughing as she danced in the moonlight. A man with kind eyes, holding out a hand in a gesture of love. A child, running through the halls, her laughter echoing through the house. These were not her memories, but they felt as real as her own. They were fragments of a life lived long ago, a life that had been forgotten by the world, but not by the house. The house remembered, and now so did she. The music grew louder, more intense, as the images came faster, blurring together in a kaleidoscope of emotions. Joy, sorrow, love, loss. They all mingled together, creating a tapestry of a life that had been full and rich, but ultimately ended in tragedy. As the final note rang out, the images faded, leaving Amara breathless and trembling. She realized then that the house had chosen her. It had called to her, drawn her in, because it knew that she was the one who could bring its memories back to life. She was the one who could piece together the fragments of being that had been scattered by time. And so, she began to explore the house in earnest, determined to uncover its secrets, to learn the stories of those who had lived and loved and lost within its walls. Each room held a new piece of the puzzle, a new fragment of being that she would carefully piece together. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Amara became part of the house, just as the house became part of her. She learned to see the world through its eyes, to feel the emotions of those who had come before her. And in doing so, she discovered not just the history of the house, but also the history of herself. For in the end, the fragments of being were not just the memories of the house, but also the memories of her own soul, scattered across time and space, waiting to be found and made whole once again. Would you like to continue this story or explore a specific part in more detail? What happens next? Sure. Here's what happens next in Fragments of Being. Days turned into a blur as Amara continued to unravel the secrets of the house. She found herself lost in its corridors, where each door she opened revealed another piece of the puzzle, another fragment of a life long gone. But as she delved deeper, the house began to change. What had once felt welcoming now carried an undercurrent of unease. The first sign of change came in the form of shadows. At first, they were just faint flickers at the edge of her vision, barely noticeable. But soon, they grew bolder, lingering in the corners of rooms, stretching along the walls like dark tendrils. They seemed to move with a purpose, drawn toward her, yet slipping away when she tried to confront them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara found herself in the attic, a space she had avoided until now. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. Boxes and trunks were piled haphazardly, filled with the forgotten remnants of another time. But it was a large, ornate mirror, covered with a heavy sheet, that caught her attention. She hesitated before pulling the sheet away, a strange feeling of dread settling in her stomach. The mirror, once uncovered, was a thing of beauty, its frame intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize, and its surface smooth as glass. But what disturbed her was her reflection. It wasn't just her own image she saw. Behind her stood a figure, barely discernible, its face obscured in shadow. Amara spun around, but the attic was empty. Heart pounding, she turned back to the mirror, only to find that the figure was still there, closer now, its hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder. She stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. The mirror, however, remained unchanged, the shadowy figure still gazing at her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. She fled the attic, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the house seemed to shift around her. The hallways were longer, darker, and the once familiar rooms now seemed foreign, as if they belonged to a different place altogether. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating and relentless. It was then that Amara began to hear the whispers. They were faint at first, just a soft murmur that she could almost mistake for the wind. But as she strained to listen, the words became clearer, more distinct. "Help us! Remember us! Bring us back!" The voices were pleading, desperate, and they filled her with a deep sense of sorrow. These were the voices of the lost, the ones whose lives had been shattered into fragments, scattered and forgotten. They were calling out to her, begging her to piece them back together, to restore what had been broken. But as the voices grew louder, they also grew more insistent, more demanding. The shadows that had once lingered in the corners now surged forward, closing in on her, their presence overwhelming and oppressive. They were not just memories, they were something more, something alive, and they wanted something from her. In a moment of clarity, Amara realized that the house was not just a vessel for the past, it was a prison. The souls trapped within it were not at peace. They were bound to the house, unable to move on, because their stories had been left unfinished.